Hello and welcome to another in my series in conversation with. And today I have an author who lives up in Dublin called Michael Wood, and he has recently produced a book called Just One Conscious Breath. So I'm going to hand you over to him and let him introduce himself and tell you a bit about his life and his work before we get into the chat. Okay, thank you for coming on, Michael.
And thank you, Luke. Thank you for the invitation. I suppose I better practice what I preach and take a conscious breath. And I think that I'll be trying to take conscious breaths as we talk together, because when we take a conscious breath, we kind of stop the constant chat in our head, and we have the opportunity to just reflect on what we're saying and to be a bit more present. So my book, One Conscious Breath, is all about that.
Okay.
It took me
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background before we get into the book proper?
Yeah, of course, Luke. Sorry. So I'm just retired from my job as a principal of a special school for children with autism and complex needs in Dublin. They taught me an awful lot, actually, about being present and being honest with your emotions and being authentic. Before that, I was working with children with a hearing impairment. I built a house in the Sleeping Mountains and had a couple of retreats there. And that was after I moved to Ireland. Before coming to Ireland, where I've lived very happily for 30 years, I was working in London as a head of marketing for some government agencies, the British Council, the British Tourist Authority, and the Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England, which is a mouthful. But that was an interesting. But it was sort of very much dealing with large organizations and trying to help them change. And that was complex. And my heart really wasn't in it, but my heart really wasn't in office life. So I kind of retrained and I became a primary school teacher. And I sold the flat in London, not the wisest economic move, and went to live in the Lake District and taught there for about 3 or 4 years. And then following that, I sort of followed my heart and moved to Ireland, where I'd been for the last 30 years. So I sort of always say I'm English by birth and an Irish resident by choice. So that's the potted history. A bit of business, a lot of education. Born in England and living for the last 30 years in Ireland.
Yeah, great. That's very interesting. Yeah, there's some commonalities there. I sort of worked in advertising and marketing, graphic design in London and then in Dublin. And then I just kind of, I never really liked that whole environment. So I ended up getting out of that. And I actually built the house we're in now it's in the middle of the country in Kerry. So, yeah, that's quite interesting, just coincidental kind of commonalities there. But, yeah, I think following your heart is really something that, we should all do, but it requires a sort of like a kind of bravery, really, that you don't always know that you have. I've always been quite terrified of heights, but I once did a bungee jump and I was absolutely terrified and I had to literally force myself to do it. But after I did it, I thought, wow, that was exhilarating. And I went up and did it a second time. And I just thought, well, all that fear was actually not really necessary. And I think following your heart, there is this kind of fear of failure. So quite often people, they don't go there because they're just worried it's not going to work. You're worried you're going to fall off the edge and die, but quite more often than not, actually, you're not going to fall to your death. You're going to be okay. But it just requires that kind of leap of faith, that kind of trust in your own self, I suppose, trust in your own heart that it is the right thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that love and fear are sort of opposite sides of an incomplete circle, in a sense. And fear, in a way, is a sort of absence of love. It's an absence of sort of doing the right thing for ourselves and what's holding us back. And I think you're right about it taking a leap of faith to do something new. But I think sometimes we also need the clarity of the head, because sometimes our heads are just so busy. They're so full of stuff and so full of narrative that it holds us back. We're constantly listening to the stuff that's going on in our head that we can't actually hear the voice of the heart. So the voice of the heart sort of murmurs quite quietly. But if the head is too noisy, it's sometimes hard to hear it.
Well, that kind of brings us neatly to where I was, the first topic we was going to bring up, which is breath work. And how did you come to this idea of working with the breath?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I've been meditating for a long time, but look, I never really quite got there with meditation. And then in lockdown, I studied with Eckhart Tolle, who's influenced me a lot. His books, Power of Now and The New Earth, that I've listened to and read a lot. And then during lockdown, I saw he was doing a course called A Course of Awakening. It was an online course, like everything during lockdown. But it was really, really good. And Eckhart's all about presence and being present and being in the body. But there was something kind of missing for me from that course. It wasn't anything that was missing in the course, but it was all in my head. It was all in the head. And that actually I felt that somehow I had to embody this learning. And so I came to breath work that way. Through a couple of people on the course. We were just chatting together after the course online. And one of them said, have you thought about breath work? And they recommended a school. And I looked into that one. And then eventually I signed up for Transformations, which is a school of breath work, the oldest school of breath work in America. And it's part of the Global Professional Breathwork Alliance, which is like a governing body for professional body for breath work. And what I did there was I was introduced to a professional breathworker in the UK. I've been working for 50 years in something called rebirthing or conscious connected breathing. And over about 10 sessions of about an hour and a half, you have a very deep exploration of yourself through your breath. And I had a bit of a breakthrough moment, to be honest, with this breath work after about 7 or 8 sessions. And it was rather strange. I was on the River Thames on a barge, just about 2 or 3 miles upstream from where I was born. And there was a long period of quiet and silence. And after that, sort of almost a period of reverie, I came back and I realized that I'd been being breathed, that I wasn't necessarily the person who was doing the breathing. There was something else that was actually happening to me. And it just felt that everything was flowing. The river Thames was flowing beneath me. It just felt that my heart was flowing as well, and the breath was flowing, and everything felt congruent. And from that moment, I haven't really looked back. That was the seed of a whole new awakening. And I think for me, the thing was that I never really learned to let go in meditation. That sometimes, you have a mantra or you can use the breath in meditation or look at a candle. But, you have to use something to lose it. And then in the losing it, you kind of let go and you surrender. But it was only in these sort of supervised breathwork sessions that I fully understood the concept of just letting go and letting go into the flow of life. And that's been a very magical phase for me.
Yeah, it sounds very Taoist, actually. I was thinking of that when you mentioned about the river and the flow of it. It's, it's something that is common to many different paths, but it really struck me as sort of, I've read some of the Taoist works of Lao Tzu and stuff like that, and that it made me think of that straight away of Tao or Tao, I think is the correct way to say it. Uh, and like how things become harmonious when you follow the flow of the universe or nature or whatever you want to call it. Sort of this cosmic flow that sort of, if you're aligned with it, then everything just seems to just happen correctly and without any real great effort.
I think that's it, completely for me. And it was that kind of alignment. And ever since then, I found that my life has just flowed in a much, much more harmonious way. I mean, I have to, and I think it's about getting your head out of the way. And that's where the breath, sometimes just taking a breath kind of reconnects me to that time and place. But absolutely, I think that it's all there for us, but we've got to peel away all the layers of the onion and get to, who we are in our core. And I think that's kind of involves peeling away all the layers of conditioning and ego that we built up over the years. And it just takes a long time to do that. It's not something that can happen overnight. And for me, the final layer of the onion was letting go of everything and realizing that this is it. This is where I'm at. This is where it's at. And I don't really need to do anything now. I just need to try and tap into that.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's something that maybe you tap into again and again, because I think modern life and just maybe human behavior is that we tend to like gradually sort of go off the rails a bit. And like you might be on a good path today, but then in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, you could be back in the shite again, so to speak, because you staying on this sort of like conscious or harmonious way of being. But there's so many distractions in life, and even our own, like everyone has their own foibles. Like, I mean, I love food. I have to be careful not to just eat constantly and end up like the size of a house, because I like that, but I'm aware that it's not good for me and unhealthy. So I try to sort of moderate myself, but it's very easy to sort of unconsciously just slip into loads of terrible bad habits, and then before you know it, you're in a terrible place again. So I suppose I was leading to the next thing is you said about one conscious breath, not many breaths, but one conscious breath. So can you explain to listeners, viewers rather, what you mean by that and how that actually works?
So I think that breathing is the only thing that we can do consciously or unconsciously. We can't consciously circulate our blood or digest our food, but we can consciously and unconsciously breathe. So the breath becomes a portal of our awareness. It sort of takes us across from one side to the other side. It's like a bridge. And I think that for me, just one conscious breath is, when I'm aware I'm doing it, I'm taking that breath. It brings me back to a place of awareness on the barge. And going back to what you were saying, Luke, about there are so many tricks and traps out there for us to constantly fall over and fall down. And it happens to me all the time. But I'm lucky in that if I just take one conscious breath, it kind of reconnects me to that level of awareness that I had on the barge. Because I think once we have that awareness, we don't lose it. It's not like physical exercise, our fitness that, we run a marathon and then we get back on the food and we can't run a marathon again. We actually, we get a level of awareness, we get that sort of fitness, spiritual fitness, but we can actually reconnect that with just one conscious breath. So that's a one level for me that it brings me right back to that level of awareness. But I think there's also a practical aspect to one conscious breath, that it can actually just take us out of the here and now, and just enables us to go on that bridge and just look back at where we're at, what we're saying, what we're doing, what we're eating, what we're drinking. Well, look at our hand on the fridge door. Think, hang on, maybe I don't need to do this. To just take that breath and to just become aware and monitor ourselves and look at ourselves. So it does a couple of things. It connects me with my source, but it also distances me from all the stuff that's going on in my life. And of course, nowadays with our phones, and we're blessed to be talking through this phone now, but they amplify all the noise and magnify all the distraction. And it's just like a rabbit hole. I just go down rabbit holes on Instagram and things, and it's really hard, and of course they're designed to keep us down there.
It eats time as well. I very much, it eats time as well, I notice.
Yeah.
I'm very much a believer that time is relative. Well, of course, physicists would say that anyway, but in actual lived experience, I've noticed the huge difference in when you're go on a computer, time just accelerates at this incredible speed. And I've done like experimenting, like I throw like, right, if I sit here and just watch the hands on the clock, I'm going to sit here for 2 minutes and watch the clock tick around. And you just think that 2 minutes just lasts forever. It just seems to go on and on and on endlessly. And like when you're having a great time, everything goes fast. And when you're having a really terrible time, everything seems to go very, very slowly. So I feel that time is all relative, but definitely when you get involved in this whole social media, the Instagram, the Facebook, the Twitter, I don't have Twitter, but I've only recently got Instagram. But yeah, it could just eat your entire day if you let it. And your mind is just pulled into this place where you're out of your body. You're not rooted. You're not grounded. You're sort of sucked into this cyberspace place. We don't really use that term anymore. I remember at the beginning of the whole internet, everyone was on about cyberspace. But like, yeah, you get pulled into the world of the internet, and it just sort of it eats your attention and your actual time. The time you've got, you might have like I saw. So you got 8 hours of your day. You start off on that, and it's just eaten the whole day before you know it.
I completely agree, and it's designed that way. So, we're a captive audience, and there are sort of rabbit hole algorithms to keep us down there because our attention is valuable. It's a great resource for the online marketers who know exactly what they're doing. And we're completely sort of numbed out and zoned out by all this stuff that's being bombarded at us. And I think that the proof of the pudding is always how you feel afterwards. Like if you have a chat with a really good friend, you come away and you feel great. You feel sort of you've contributed to something really positive. But if you have a couple of hours online and come away from that, you feel groggy. You feel kind of brain dead. You don't feel good at all. You don't feel like you have to walk in the countryside. And that is the proof of the pudding. It's not doing us any good. Yeah.
I've often felt that in my face. Like I've spent a lot of time on the computer. My face is all tense, almost like it's made out of paper. And it's like, I don't feel like it's I don't feel myself anymore. I feel weird. So, I mean, I remember years ago, I learned a few techniques from a yoga teacher in India, which are really great, because your blood vessels, I think what happens is you're not really moving your face. You're just using your eyes and you're breathing very shallow and you just sit there barely moving, just moving your hands and your eyes. And then your whole your body's sort of like shutting down almost because it's not doing anything. You're just sat there static for like a really long period of time. So, yeah, there's things this guy showed me, like a simple breathing technique with the thumb and the finger to like alternating, and then sort of using your hands and your fingers to stimulate your face again, to get all the blood vessels and the nerves reactivated. Because you haven't used your facial muscles for so long. You've sat there for 3 hours, say. Your face has gone to sleep completely, and that's why your head feels all weird. And of course, your brain's being bombarded with electrons from the TV screen because you're so close to it, and the electromagnetic field of the computer and the screen as well. So it's all of it's pretty bad for you if you do it for a long period of time.
It's a heck of a lot, really, when you listen to what you just reeled off. And I suppose what we're doing, at least now, is we're interacting with one another.
Yeah.
So that involves an element of adaptation of the face and interaction with one another and drinking our water. It's interesting too. And speaking, of course, speaking, and listening. But it's interesting that, I've got one of these Apple Watch things, and just, I don't know why. I think because it's handy to pay with things and to make sure I do my exercise every day. But they're very keen on people standing, every hour you move. And apparently it really changes the dynamic. You can just get up every hour and just do 5 minutes and then go back to the screen. It just really does recalibrate the body, and changes everything. So I think we mustn't get stuck. Yeah, we mustn't get stuck to these little screens at all.
I can remember when first started working with computers, they were really big on this thing. No more than 4 hours in a row. You got to get up. You should have 5 to 10 minutes every hour. Get up, go do something else. And all this stuff. You got to have the right chair, and you got to this and do that, and all these different things. They were really big on that. And then somehow that was in like the early 90s that people were talking about this, in the late 80s. And then you never even hear about this stuff anymore. No, hardly anyone even mentions it. Which is thinking, what happened? Why did it suddenly just disappear from the consciousness that people aren't interested in this anymore like they were?
Maybe we just got more addicted.
Yeah, you could be right.
Yeah, I mean, the founder of Facebook now has gone on record as saying that they made it to be as addictive as possible, and now they're worried about the mental health of their young users. Yeah. But
yeah. Well,
look, it's like Coca-Cola. It ain't good for you. It's not meant to be. It's just meant to be addictive.
No, but the funny thing about Coca-Cola, when it was first created, it was sold as a sort of medicinal drink. At the beginning, when it did in fact contain cocaine at the beginning, and I think it was green. It's actually green originally, and then they added the brown coloring from caramel to make it that kind of brown color that it is. But I think it's, obviously they've changed a lot from the original recipe, whether they're the cola nut or whatever. So I mean, it was sold as a health product, but it couldn't be more unhealthy, could it?
No, it couldn't. I think, no, it couldn't. And of course, because it's addictive, it's you're compounding the badness of it really by having a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite nice to drink. I do love cola, so I actually started buying there's a UK brand. It's a small family company that make this. Well, I shouldn't really advertise it, but Fentimans it's called, and there's some German cola you can get as well, which is also made from organic stuff, and small family business. I forget what it's called. So they're very expensive, relatively speaking, but they're like 2 or 3 times the price. But I thought, well, if I want to have some cola, say, especially like long trips, it's good to have a caffeine drink. Although I never touch things like, the Red Bulls of this world and all that kind of thing, because they're so toxic. But it is good. I like that kind of genre, the cola, but I just really object to supporting a quite an evil multinational company, because I'm sure when they started the business, it wasn't completely sort of morally bankrupt. Just like McDonald's, the original people that own McDonald's, they weren't evil. It just got taken over by a psychopath. I don't know if you've seen that film, The Founder.
I have, yeah.
I never knew the story of McDonald's. I actually worked for them when I was a student for a brief period of time. And I cooked everything on the menu, which, well, you wouldn't really call it cooking. I constructed the food that's on the menu. So I knew their menu backwards and all the horrors of what they call food, but it isn't really food. But I mean, when that company started, as the film illustrates, and probably is a book about it too, I think, they were just a small business, 2 brothers trying to make burgers for people that were affordable, and, it was quite a nice little business. It wasn't a corporate nightmare that was just like trying to sort of like feed people absolute rubbish. And I think, it's the same with many of these companies, the big cola companies and many food companies, etc., etc. what they started out as was quite benign, and then over time they've got subverted and become something completely different.
I suppose it's the concept of exponential growth.
Yeah.
Just keep and keep increasing the dividend for the shareholders.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on something that we discussed before we run out of time, and I'll have to restart the recording. There was something we mentioned, I think, when we talked on the phone, which was about mindfulness. And you made an interesting point about it perhaps being a bit of a misnomer. And I thought about what you said, and you're kind of right in a way, because mindfulness is perhaps the opposite of what it sounds like, because you don't want your mind to be full of stuff. So when they're talking about being mindful and being conscious and perhaps emptying out all this crap in your head, the actual word itself implies the opposite, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to an interview with a famous Buddhist scholar who was saying that really the correct translation of mindfulness is actually presence. The word that they've used for mindfulness is actually presence, and that being present is what we're trying to be here with one another, and listening and responding. Isn't necessarily mindful, because when we're listening to one another, we're not necessarily thinking about what we're going to say next. We're just present and aware of what the person is saying and see what flows from that. So it's actually, in a way, it's the reverse of our mind being full. It's our mind being open. And in a way, it's empty of the clutter, the self-narrative. So it's, in a way, mindfulness is really mind openness. And it can be that the word full people could interpret it as that. It's not at all. It's more that. It's more being open and ready and present. So.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I had never heard anyone suggest that before, and I thought, yeah, that actually made perfect sense. And I talking about people being present and responding, I've noticed, I mean, something I do myself, where you have a conversation with somebody, and sometimes you're not really listening, you're waiting to talk, and you've already got something in your head that you want to say, and you're more thinking about that and waiting for the other person to stop speaking so you can say that. So that's not being present at all, really, is it? That's like, it's not really a good conversation if you're in that space where you're just waiting to spit out what you've already decided you're going to talk about. So presence is like you say, not doing that and being open, where you're really listening, and then you're in the now, where you're not thinking about what you're going to say. You're going to say something based on what you've heard just now, rather than what you've already thought about 2, 3, 4, and 5 minutes ago.
Absolutely, because I think, look, if we're responding to what's in our head, as you say, it's 2 or 3, 4 minutes ago, but what you want is flow. You want conversation to flow, and that's flowing with the energy of cooperation, and mutual support and understanding and empathy. And that's not about having a prearranged question in your head or trying to get a point across. It's actually listening and attending to what the person is saying. And then seeing what is appropriate in response to that. So it's the very opposite of an egocentric conversation. It's just two people being present and seeing where that goes. Yeah,
there's a terrible absence of that, I think, in many conversations, where, especially when you say wanting to make a point, like in arguments, people are often, or a debate, they're not really listening to what the other person's saying. They just want to get their point in next, and as many points in as they can to win the argument, rather than actually being a real exchange or listening to someone. Whereas sometimes if you listen to someone, you really listen, you might have a point of view, and you might actually change your point of view because you've listened. Whereas if you've already predetermined what you're going to say and what you think, and you're not going to be open, then then you've no possibility of changing how you think or how you feel, or what, because you've just already shut yourself off to external input, and it's really basically a pointless conversation in a way, especially if you've got two people doing that. If both people are just shouting their thoughts that they've already got at the other person, it's just utterly pointless, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the key is the listener. In a way, the listener is just open. I think you were talking about Lao Tzu, and I think Lao Tzu talks about spacious listening. And that's the key to transforming the world. When we actually listen to one another openly with our heart, and they feel heard, that anything is possible. It's like it's a heart-to-heart conversation. And that's a different order of magnitude and awareness than a head-to-head or an ego-to-ego conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important skill. If people could be taught to do that, to actually really listen to each other instead of like waiting in a queue to speak your opinion, or a rebuttal, and so much of this, what I see certainly in what you see in conversations on the mainstream and everything, and in the news and blah blah, that's pretty much how it is. It's just two people talk, or three people, or however many, talking at each other, not with or to each other. It's kind of sad.
It is sad because the potential is huge, but I mean 95% of conversations, I'd say, are ego to ego, roughly, whereas I say 1 or 2% is heart to heart, and that's where transformation can take place, is when people really listen to one another. But I don't think you teach, I think you can model it. I think that, some of particularly the non-speaking autistic children at school, they kind of modeled that kind of spacious listening to me.
Okay, so the mindfulness really is more about presence. So to you, what does that involve from a practical point of view? Because we can read about all this till the cows come home, but ultimately what people really need to know is about how do you achieve that in reality? What would you say? What in your opinion is
that was it?
You become fully present.
That was
Silence.
it.
Silence. Quiet. Quiet. I get you. That's a very good metaphysical joke. Yeah.
I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. Really, we just are, and the people who are with us know we are, and they are, and we both are. And there's no plateau, there's no head stuff. It's just being together.
That's kind of there is sort of like a trick in a way. You know how humans are really good at deluding themselves. We're really good at that, and like denial and all this stuff. So to me, I think I think you can almost trick yourself into being present by, little ways of doing things, little sort of techniques, mind sort of like gym, if you must, where you're not present, you're thinking about 100 different things, and you're like so again, the breath is one of those techniques to bring you into a state of presence, a state of calm, where instead of being like on an airplane, you've got this big display, and all the dials are flashing like crazy. You're overstimulated. Everything's going nuts. Just sort of switching all that off. And yeah, meditation's been a big part of my life. But as you know yourself, breath is really important. And there was an interesting, I think he was, I'm not sure if he was Tibetan, but he was a Buddhist monk, and he did like a walking meditation where he concentrating on the breath, but instead of being like sat there sort of zoned out and sort of going off into like the ether, so to speak. It was sort of a different way of meditating where you're walking and you're present in a sort of state of calm as you walk. So you're aware of what's going on around you, but you're in a state of peace and sort of, I suppose, harmoniousness with what's going on around you.
I think that was Thich Nhat Hanh who developed that walking meditation, who actually was the person who introduced mindfulness to the West. And I think it's just about taking a step, like taking a breath, and, letting your step, letting your foot fall onto the ground. The process of walking, you're nothing else but walking. Just like when you're breathing, you're nothing else but breathing. I think it's all about trying to stop the jibber jabber of the head, really. Whatever you do to try and stop this narrative, this thing. This is the problem. It's staring us in the face. When we over-identify with our thoughts, we get lost in them.
Yeah. In a way, it's a really very, very simple, but it's also when you don't know how to do it or you can't do it, it's the hardest thing in the world.
Well, it's very seductive. As we were talking about phones and how seductive they are, but the head is the same. It wants to make us think that it's where the action is, our thoughts and our ideas and our intellect, that's where it's all at. But I don't believe that's where it is at all. I think it's in the quiet beyond the head where it's at. And that's like when we take one conscious breath, we just step outside of the jibber jabber of the head, and we get to a sense of calm. So that's why, for me, just one conscious breath is a very powerful technique. Just cuts through the jibber jabber.
Mm. And I found in my own life, actually, strangely, that by switching off and being calm and being present, it actually really helps with the sort of creative and intellectual processes. That by stepping away from it, when you come back to trying to do something that's very focused, that you can do it better because you've had that quiet, because you've stepped out of this maelstrom of constant input, that when you do want to do something, that it's actually, you're more focused, it's easier, you're able to sort of achieve what you're trying to do with greater clarity, because you've had that stepping out from all this kind of constant mental sort of I suppose it's conflict in a way, because you've got all these conflicting inputs and ideas that are just spinning around constantly, and it just creates an awful mess. And obviously, how can you focus when you've got 57 thoughts all at once, all competing with each other for attention of your mind?
Absolutely. And there's been quite a lot of research into flow states, particularly for artists. Like sometimes my partner's a pianist, and when she plays, her mind is purely about the playing. She's not in her head, she's in the music. Another friend of mine's a sculptor, and he talks about times where he just time passes and he's just creating his sculpture, and he just doesn't think at all. And those are flow states because they're not in the head at all. It's actually the whole body, the heart is creating the creativity. So there's nothing getting in the way of the creation of the music, of the sculpture. It's just happening in flow, which is what we were talking about a little bit about the creation of a conversation, that when you're both in your heart space, the conversation will flow, because there's no jibber jabber, there's no distraction pulling it putting it in sort of egocentric ways or in predetermined ways.
Mm. Something we talked about on the phone, which when you were introducing yourself, you mentioned about your education and people who are like neurodiverse. In my own past, I used to work with people with addiction problems. I mean, in this country, there's an enormous problem. Well, there's problems in many countries. For instance, America's got this fentanyl crisis, but in Ireland, you've got a very, very tiny number of facilities to deal with addiction problems, which is like literally, I don't think it's even 10 places really. At one point, it was something like 6. And then you've got an enormous problem with addiction to alcohol, addiction to drugs, and now you've got internet addiction, you've got pornography addiction, and gambling addiction, because now you've got teenage kids managing to get the details off their parents' Visa card. They put it into their phone and they're doing gambling apps on their mobile phone and, getting into trouble, and developing, in their teens, developing serious addictions. So, I mean, you've looked into this, how it can be beneficial to people in many different areas. I would have thought it would be very beneficial for people in addiction, as well as people who are like trying to deal with, say, autism or Asperger's or whatever else, where you've got some kind of neural complications that make your life difficult. You want to talk about that a little bit from your perspective?
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of things there. There's a whole area of addiction and neurodivergence, and and there's a sort of commonality, I think, possibly between them. I mean, talking about addiction, I kind of grew up with alcohol. I think I was always been a middle lane drinker. Never too fast, never too slow, but just going there in my own time. So I've stopped drinking for a while, and certainly feel much sharper as a result of that. And I think that there's a lot of awareness now around, the Alcohol Anonymous approach. Has been very successful. But there are new modern approaches to addiction now in terms of dealing with cravings and so forth, and that actually a craving can be a sort of a wake-up call that actually I've got a craving now. I'll just surf this wave, and I'll use my breath to help me surf this wave of craving, and just try and get over the craving with my breath. Or just as I'm about to reach into the fridge for another cold beer, I just take a breath and think, is this really what I should be doing or what I need to be doing? So that's how the breath is going to help me. I think with neurodivergent children, that sometimes they can be in crisis, and sometimes their behavior is their way of communication, especially if you're nonverbal. Then you're actually showing what you want through your behavior, or how you're feeling through your behavior. And sometimes they can't tell you that something's sore or a part of them they're feeling sick because they don't have the words. And so it's only through the behavior we try and figure out what's going on here. And sometimes you get when I was at school, you'd have a crisis. A crisis would be a situation whereby the child was in danger themselves, or they were putting other people in danger, or other people were in danger as a result of the behavior, children or staff. And when you had a crisis, you knew what needed to happen. You wanted to diffuse the crisis, and you'd say what you actually wanted them to do was to take a breath, because that's the best way to diffuse the crisis is, just take a breath. So with the children who were verbal, I would ask a question, stop a second, are you breathing? And of course they would say, of course I'm bloody breathing. But at least that would make them actually stop and assess whether or not they were breathing, and you would try and break the cycle. But with the non-verbal kids, if you would say, take a breath, they would be so mad that they actually, the last thing they want is more words, more. It's like putting another log on the fire, you know. So the only thing you can do is be the breath that you want them to be. So it's all about modelling. Education is all about modelling, in my opinion.
So,
I would try
showing them. So would you have to?
Sorry?
Would you have to physically show them in that case?
Yeah.
Rather
so you'd be
tell them.
Yeah.
You do it
exactly.
and get them.
You be the breath.
Okay, right. I guess
you emanate it. They're not even ready to for any instruction. So, but you know the electromagnetic field of the heart is 5,000 times as powerful as their head. So if you can be calm in the middle of their crisis and just be the breath that you want them to be, you're modeling the breath you want them to be, but you're also diffusing it for yourself and coping yourself, and you're creating the environment whereby the situation can diffuse.
So they almost pick it up by osmosis. Then they like react to that, and then they start to emulate that themselves. Right. So yeah. I suppose that makes perfect sense, because if they're very non-verbal, they would pick up on that much quicker than someone who's in their head totally inverbal. These kind of physical and sort of emotional cues, they're going to pick them up and react to them. Yeah. So 100%. That makes perfect sense then. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
So again, and it can happen in the lift too. You know, you might be in the lift with a mum and a toddler, and she's having a crisis. Then, but just be generous with your breath, and be the breath that you'd like her to have, and at least that can radiate the kind of atmosphere and the intention, and it can certainly do no harm. You know,
yeah, that's quite interesting, because there's this theory that
often when I'm,
sorry. I was going to say there's a theory 90% of communication or something like that is actually non-verbal. And I can think of instances of that, like say that it's quite obvious when you think about it, but it's not always. People don't behave as if that's the case. Like when you walk into a room for the first time and there's a bunch of people in there, right? You're doing this subconsciously, and everyone in the room is doing this. Well, you walk into the room, and in a matter of seconds, you absorb this entire panorama and everybody in it, and you react to what you see and you feel and what you're absorbing. But most people are doing this completely subconsciously, and they don't even realize that whole interaction, when you go into, say, a room at a party or a meeting, whatever, everything that is going to happen from that point onwards is based on that initial few seconds that you walk in and you absorb what's going on around you. And that leads to everything else that's going to happen from that moment onwards. So before you even speak, before you say a single word to anyone, or anyone says a word to you, there's this massive interaction that's happened between you and the room and everyone in it, and everybody else, conversely, they're seeing you come into, and you've just suddenly changed the whole dynamic of that room. And every time a new person comes in, that happens again and again with every single different person that comes into that. But I think a lot of people are completely unconscious of this. Would you be inclined to agree with me on that, or what do you feel about that whole dynamic of non-verbal communication?
I do. I think that's the non-verbal communication is why, for me, the non-speaking autistic kids were my greatest teachers. I've had a lot of spiritual teachers in my life, but it was the non-speaking neurodivergent children that really, really taught me so much. But I think another way of looking at being in the room is just flip the coin, and instead of being attracted to people, I think be attractive to them, and you be the magnet. You know, your heart is that 5,000 times more powerful. And if you're focused and still and breathing, you'd be surprised how much things will come to you, flow to you, because you're becoming quieter and quite powerful. And so it can actually turn the tables a little bit, that you actually go into a situation and you don't react, you don't assess, you don't judge. You just spend a little while just sort of breathing and being, and just see how that changes the whole dynamic.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I have a sort of a little thing I do myself, because I mean, sometimes I'm very present and I'm very like together, and other times I'm all over the bloody place and I'm in a right old mess, and then I just have to sort myself out. So something I do myself and I recommend to other people is just stopping and literally counting to 10. 1, 2, and just breathing while you do that. And that 10 count to 10 gives you that little bit of space, rather than rushing in and reacting to everything, sort of like like in flight or fight mode. But that counting to 10 gives you, your brain, your mind, your heart, your whole being, a little chance to sort of just calm down and take the temperature down a bit before you then proceed into whatever you're going to do. And I found that enormously effective, because I've at times been in a panic or worried about something. And I found that, like we mentioned fear earlier, most of what is fear is actually imagination of what's going to happen. The fear and the actual occurrences that happen are usually completely different. If your fear is at 10, the actual event is probably going to be at a 1 or a 2 in reality. But your mind escalates this into a giant bubble of fear. So I think you just kind of taking that little time, for me, like the counting to 10, it just deflates that bubble of expectation and anxiety or fear, if you like. And then the reality and what you perceive it could be kind of start to align a bit better, rather than you being like full of nervousness and anxiety.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Counting to 10 is a great way to do it. It's a great trick. I've heard someone else when they're in I obviously advocate a conscious breath as well. I've heard someone, they go outside in the garden, somebody else would splash cold water on their face, anything just to sort of, to change it up a bit. But it's interesting, there's a guy called Rollo May, and he says the key to our human freedom is moving from reaction to response. So the moment when we react to something, it's like knee-jerk. We're not in control. But when we actually respond to a situation, we're actually choosing what we're doing. And that's our freedom. And I start the book with that quote by Rollo May, because that, when we take a conscious breath, we can move from reaction to response. We walk over that bridge. Okay, I'm tempted to do this right now. Is it still a good idea? What's another option?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because a lot of human behavior, certainly a lot of, from a metaphysical or spiritual point of view, a lot of what's being taught is about overcoming sort of animalistic or impulsive, instinctive reaction, and being conscious and responding, as you say, as opposed to reacting, with two very different things. Because quite often, reactions, you will do the very opposite of what is probably the best thing for you to do, because you've got split second, and if you're reacting out of fear or anxiety or some kind of negative emotion, you're probably going to do the wrong thing in many instances, I think. So,
Professor Steve Peters, I think it is, has written a lot about that in, I think, the chimp paradox. You know, that there's that primeval part of the brain which gets flooded quickly and bursts, and it, it keeps us safe. It keeps us safe tens of thousands of years ago, but we still have that part of us, that chimp in our inner chimp. And I've got a dear friend who actually talks to his chimp. You know, he's driving the car, and he's even named his chimp Fionn, an Irish warrior figure. And he said, "No, it's okay, Fionn. I'm driving the car. You can calm down." And he taught me a lot. This lovely man, and I tried that. I tried giving my chimp a name, but it didn't work. It's just more head stuff.
mm.
But what does work for me and my chimp is relaxed attention. So if my chimp knows that Michael's driving the bus, he can relax. And the way he knows that Michael's driving the bus is when he hears me breathing consciously. So I've been in quite stressful situations, and I've actually been breathing consciously, and it's like my chimp can relax because he knows that, okay, Michael's in control here. His breathing's in control. He seems to have this. I don't need to panic. So my chimp is kind of just okay. He can take a back seat, and it's very powerful.
Yeah,
Very powerful.
very good. I think another thing here is important is learning to understand what your triggers are, because I think every individual has a different set of triggers that send you into panic mode, that send you into chimp mode, if you like. And like, if you understand what those triggers are, and you're aware of, oh, here comes a trigger, right, I'm going to like deal with this, and rather than just go straight into like panic mode. If you know yourself well enough that you know what is going to set you off, I think that can be a very helpful thing.
I agree, and that's something that the neurodivergent children taught us. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what's the trigger here, because sometimes things happen out of the blue. What was that about? And we'd have to go back and look at other instances when that happened and try and figure it out. And it was actually quite a painstaking process. But when you've figured out what the trigger is for these children, it's started their pathway to understanding themselves. So, well, look, James, when this happens, this is what seems to be happening to you. So when they're triggered, we'd have what was called a zones of regulation program, whereby they would kind of recognize what state, emotional state they were in, and was linked to the lights of the when you're driving a car, you get to the traffic lights, red, green, and blue, red, green, and orange. And it was the same with them, and there's zones of regulation. So they'd have to notice, were they red and enraged, or were they green and ready? And when they were aware where they were, they would then be able to make choices. So if they were in a state of really red and angry, we would have what was called calm down choices, and they would actually choose what choice to take to actually calm down. And some would be breathing, some would be playing with some putty, or going for a walk, or bouncing on the trampoline, or whatever. So for them, their freedom was about recognizing their triggers and choosing what to do to try and allay them.
Yeah, I think to a lesser extent, everybody has something somewhere that will trigger them. There's a lot to do with your life, your upbringing, whatever, past experiences, etc. Maybe it's less extreme, less visible in non-neurodivergent people, but there's always like something like, I'll give you like a stupid example. Say you don't get on with one of your in-laws, and they know that you're a bit sensitive about, say you've got like some sticky out ears, and they're going to keep bringing that up to provoke you, to upset you. So, that could be a trigger for you. And if people mention your ears, you're going to get. But then the thing is, if you that's just like an ordinary sort of person thing. If you're aware of that and you know that someone's trying to provoke you, and then like using these techniques like being breathing, trying to sort of be present, and you think about, right, someone's just thrown a trigger at me, then if you're aware of it, then you have the opportunity to actually not respond, or react rather. You can respond in a positive way. But I think it's part of that being already present enough that you notice that someone's just thrown a sort of spear at you or whatever, thrown a
Yeah,
trigger at you, rather than you just immediately go "Argh!" and go bananas at them. It's just really all these things, that these decisions and all these actions or non-reactions, or a response. You've really only got a very a limited window, literally in seconds, before you're either in that state of craziness or you're remaining calm. It happens so fast. It's really literally, isn't it, a few seconds?
yeah, it is. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It is about being present enough to realise here's coming a sphere. It's coming at me. Am I going to catch it? Am I going to duck it? What am I going to do about it? How am I going to react to it? And of course, the best people at triggering us are the ones who are closest to us. They know the buttons. They know what to push. Especially at Christmas time.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, that's very true. Something you mentioned, we're kind of coming to the end now, was the idea about love and fear. And I mean, these are such powerful motivating forces in our lives, aren't they? Uh, Obviously, the opposite ends of the spectrum, but so much of what we do as people, even in our sort of sophisticated, complicated lives, I mean, that's something I'm very aware of from having had a background in marketing, advertising, design. You're probably aware of Edward Bernays, and how he applied psychology to his, I think, is it his uncle or great uncle was, the founder of modern psychology, and he employed these techniques to manipulate people, love and fear really being the source of all these sort of impulses that to go out and buy stuff or do stuff, or lifestyle choices, as it's now become a level of sophistication. Basically, I think these are the major motivating forces in human existence, really. So, would you like to expand on that, or whatever? What your thoughts on these two?
As you were talking, I was thinking about a recent, election campaign, and how so much of what was being said, people was motivating people by fear. And I think love is that quiet voice within us that knows the right thing to do. And I think to hear that voice of love, sometimes we have to have an uncluttered head. But, fear is, I think the ego is quite frightened. The ego wants to stay in the driving seat. That's where a lot of our fear comes from. That the head wants to remain in control, because that's the illusion that we are brought up to believe, and our self-narrative and our busy heads, that this is where it's at. And it is where it's at, but it has to come from a quiet place. It has to come from the voice of love. And when the head can respond to the heart, which is a place of love, then we're aligned and we can flow. We were talking about that whole thing of Taoist flow. So I think it's about hearing the quiet voice of the heart, having an uncluttered head so we're not going off off track and we're not identifying with our thoughts. And I think that the voice of fear is when we identify with our thoughts. We actually think that's where the action's at. It's not where the action's at. Our action is in our heart. It's in the quiet voice that we get to when we get beyond all these thoughts, beyond all this noise. And we go, yes, that's the voice of peace and joy and hope. And then it's a case of I've heard it, how do I go there? Well, I take a breath. I know it's not always going to be simple, and I know I'm going to get distracted along the way, but that is where my joy is. That is where my contentment is. And that's where I need to flow.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think definitely you're right about that in terms of love. But my own feeling about fear is that it's something that's been really subverted, because in essence, right, if there's some like tiger about to come in through the back door and eat your whole family, or some horrible person that's going to stab you or something, then fear is a normal, healthy reaction, and then you're quickly going to make decisions to get out of this terrible situation. But the fact is, like, the chances of that happening are like 0.0001% in the world that we live in now, that you're not going to ever get a tiger or a maniac come in your house. But that fear, that emotional fear response has been taken and subverted and used to manipulate people to create all these non-existent bogeymen. So forever we're being presented with more bogeymen like the tiger or the crazed maniac, like, you know, the guy out The Shining with his axe, like bang down the door with the axe and murder you. But that's really, for most, that such things are such a rarity in anyone's life, that kind of fear response just really isn't appropriate in 99.99% of cases. But it's still, they employ it. It's employed by so many different things to get a response, the response they want to elicit from you.
It's so powerful. It's highly improbable, but it's the power of it that hooks us.
Yeah, it's really quite.
We don't.
Go on. Carry on with that thought.
No, it's just that we are we're so captivated by the imagery and so the savagery of it, or we get subsumed by it, and we can't actually step back from it and realize this ain't going to happen. This is just fantasy. But it's so pervasive and so powerful that it captivates us, and we can't cut through it. And it's the opposite of the voice of love, because the voice of love is calm and quiet and joyful, whereas the voice of fear is that axe in The Shining or whatever. It's they're diametrically opposed.
Yeah, it's primal, really, isn't it? And I think we're sort of trying to evolve beyond that to something that's better than our primal old selves that we were, like, thousands of years ago back in the caves. I think I think we're in a time when it's time for humanity to evolve beyond that, really.
100%, Luke. That's exactly where we're at. We're standing on the precipice now. And are we going to evolve or not? Or are we going to just keep recycling the past agendas? Or are we actually going to say, actually, if we love and we cooperate, we can get through this. We can get through anything.
Yeah. So we're kind of running out of time, but your book, Just One Conscious Breath, where would people be able to get that from?
It's available on Amazon. It's also available from directly through my website, pilgrimbreath.org. They can contact me there.
I'll put that link underneath the video.
And it's available as an e-book or as a physical book. And I think what I would say about it, Luke, is it's very practical. It's a sort of been an autobiography of awakening for me with the breath. And there are lots of exercises which I have found to be helpful at the end of each chapter.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I will put a link there, as I said, and yeah, I encourage people to check that out. And thank you so much. It's been a brilliant, interesting conversation.
Thanks, Luke. I really enjoyed it.
Right.
Very grateful to you and to your listeners. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thanks a million. Bye. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.